it oftentimes get worse every year. People have to understand that early childhood education is where it all begins. It begins at birth. And when we talk about funding, there's very little, if any, funding for early childhood education. That's where it all begins. If we don't have a strong foundation for children, they can't and learn grow. There's a very scary statistics. In Massachusetts, 43% of third graders, including almost 2/3 of the low-income students, do not read at grade level. More than half of the students don't read at grade level by third grade. It's because there's very little funding for early childhood education. My opponent, pardon me, Joe, would like to see us reform, or that typically means cut back on education. We don't have funding for early childhood education. We need funding for early childhood education if our children are going to continue to grow and prosper and fuel this economy when they become young adults.
Okay, I'm going to pull a, yes, that's what I'm going to do. I think Joe probably would like to respond to that.
Sure.
Tom says you want to cut back on funding. Do you want to respond to that?
That is the farthest thing from the truth, actually. I've never, ever said that we need to cut funding from either local aid, from our education system. I've always said that if anything, we need to restore local aid and we need to bring it back to its old levels. The only way to do that is to reform at the state level. If we reform programs like our pension system and take from some of these other programs that are excessive and out of control, then we can actually start working on fixing our schools and closing that achievement gap like my opponent said. You know, like you said, Tom, we do need to fund more in the lower grade levels. But in order to get there, we need to reform some of these programs up on the other levels.
Yes, Tom?
Perhaps I got it wrong then, Joe. Maybe I'm the one that's confused. Your recent response to the Duxbury Clipper, there was a question about what state programs are underfunded. And your response, Joe, and I quote, was reform, reform, reform. That is the only program in the state of Massachusetts that is underfunded. There are people in this room that would tell you that early childhood education is horribly underfunded. There's people in this room that would tell you that special education, from the state to the local communities, is terribly underfunded. There are clearly people in this room, as part of a regional school district, they're going to tell you that regional transportation is terribly underfunded. So if I misquoted you, forgive me, but that is what the newspaper said as a quote from you.
You're right, and the paper did say reform. But if you read that full paragraph, it also did mention that we need to cut back on the pension system. We need to go after things like the Pacheco Law and Project Labor Agreements. Never in there once did I mention that we need to cut educational benefits or cut local aid. I have been a strong proponent in every speech that I've given to anyone that we need to get back to funding local aid. And you know what? Until we can reform and actually bring money back into the budget and be able to restore local aid, then we really don't have the money to go out and spend, do we? Because we're facing I think it's, what is it, $2.5 billion structural deficit this year. So you tell me where we're going to get the money from that, and then we'll go and say, you know what, we need to start funneling more money out there.
Tom, do you know where the money's going to come?
Well, I certainly know it's not going to get any better when we pass question 3, as suggested by Joe, that we pass question 3. Joe's right. It's a 1.5 structural deficit going into July 1st, which is fiscal year 2012. If the residents of this Commonwealth pass question 3, that bumps up to $4 billion structural deficit. It's really disingenuous to talk about increasing local aid and funding for education when the policies Joe's proposing are going to result in a $4 billion structural deficit.
All right, well, we'll get into, this will be the last comment on this, and then we're going to move forward.
Going back into that, again, it seems like the easy cop-out is always go after local aid first. And yet again, I've yet to hear anything about real reform on Beacon Hill. And I know you're going to come back and you're going to tell me that, yes, we have reformed the pension system, but yet we haven't actually reformed it to a defined pay-in system. We still have a defined benefits program here at the state level. And yet, you know, we could save close to $100 million annually by going to more of a privatized system like a 401k. No one in the private sector anymore does it because it's so costly to have defined benefits.
All right. I want to move on to the next question, and it kind of blends into this, but let's talk a little bit about the Massachusetts infrastructure. You both have talked about local aid and things like that. Right now, in the Commonwealth, our roads, our bridges are sadly in need of repair. Many of the public buildings are also in great need of improvement. Given the present state of the economy and what's facing Massachusetts down the road, what can the legislature do to address the needs of the Commonwealth's infrastructure? And Tom, we start with you first.
Well, we've already got started, Fran. 4 years ago, when the governor took office, he made a major disclosure, something that had been covered up for a long time in the state of Massachusetts. And that is that we had a $19 billion deficit in repairing and maintaining and replacing our decrepit roads and bridges. It had been a big cover-up. For 19 years, nobody wanted to talk about it. Nobody wanted to fund it. They wanted to keep taxes as low as they could, so they didn't want to fix our roads and bridges. We had 38 structurally deficient bridges. Bridges you should not have been driving over, including our own Elm Street Bridge, which is now 8 years past its useful life. So this administration created a bond bill, and this legislature created a bond bill to go fix those bridges and those roads. For that reason, we in the town of Kingston got $3 million, not from the bond bill, but from stimulus money, to replace the Elm Street Bridge. Otherwise, it would not have been replaced. Fixing a problem begins with recognizing that we have a problem. A $19 billion unfunded liability is a major problem. And there was no fix in their sight. So we have taken action. We are fixing the roads. Some like to say you've got 2,000 more employees working for the state government today than you did 4 years ago. That's 100% right. They're repairing our roads, our bridges, and replacing an old, antiquated infrastructure that was our 29-campus state college system, and rebuilding our schools throughout the Commonwealth, and that's funded by our sales tax through the SBA program. It says I've got 51 seconds because it's upside down. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Tom. Joe, infrastructure. What would you like to see happen with that?
Well, going back to what I just came off of, and yes, it does blend back to reform on other levels that needs to happen, because we need to get this money back to our cities and towns so they can make sure that they get the roads and bridges fixed that need to be fixed. Yes, at the state level, we do have state highways that need to be fixed as well, and that's stuff that we can work out of our budget. But when we're spending, when we're limiting business to only 20% of the workforce because we've decided to say, okay, well, we're going to have project labor agreements and the Pacheco law, which is the strongest in the country for anti-privatization, we've done ourselves a disservice. We're costing more money to the taxpayers, and we're putting ourselves in a poor position to go out and actually fix the roads.
Okay, thank you. Tom, you want to rebut?
I'm
You have
always
1 minute.
I'm always amused by that comment, because the Pacheco law is a law that says any project or any contract over $500,000, before it is privatized, it must be reviewed by the state auditor to make sure it is in the public's good, that it makes sense financially. I don't know who can disagree with that. That before we privatize, the auditor confirms that it meets the public good. But we talk about privatization, take it away from government. Let's not forget, the most mismanaged, largest project ever conducted in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts was the Big Dig. And it was a private project. It was done by private business, not by the government, by private business. 15 seconds. Thank you.
Okay.
Well, again, going back to that and saying that the best way of doing things is through that 20% of the workforce, and saying, yes, that the auditor has to review it. That's all fine and dandy, but even under that $500,000 mark, they have the right to reject it at any point. And those are the only ones, the only contracts that the private sector actually gets to bid on. Anything over $500,000, it's automatically handed to those 20% of the workforce. I propose that, yes, you want to keep that fail-safe in and let the auditor, fine. When we have Mary Z. Connaughton as an auditor who's actually going to go to work for us, then, and only then, will we have an auditor that's in there that's actually going to go and do what's right by the taxpayer and make sure that these contracts are audited properly.
Joe,
Tom?
with all due respect, I think, my friend, you're a bit confused. I came from the private sector. I bid on projects for 500, 5 million, 25 million. And I was from the private sector. The Pacheco law did not prevent me from bidding on those contracts. The only requirement is that you be pre-qualified by DCAM to be a competent, credible company with strong financials. Now, if I may make this point, the Pacheco law is about turning over services that are provided by the government to the private sector, which in many cases I support. I think it makes sense. All the Pacheco law is saying, before we do that, they have to pass an audit. What part of that don't you agree with?
Part of the audit
Nope.
isn't it that they have to be unionized, correct?
No, it's not.
All right,
I was not a union company.
In 1993, William Weld was able to save 2% of the overall budget by going out to bid and finding these contracts. We've also looked at Florida, which is another case study where they've been able to save, I believe it's $84 million is off the top of my head, by going out to private sectors and going and shopping and letting it go out to bid. Are you against free market? Is that what you're saying?
I'm
Tom?
all for. I'm a free market guy. I've made my living in a free market. All
You
I'm
say
saying-
that, but
Wait,
you say
gentlemen.
that, Tom, but when
Gentlemen.
you're looking at this, you're telling me that you don't want parts of
I believe I had the floor.
the industry. Go ahead.
So just, I just want to kind of go over the rules of the debate again, just so we're,
Oh,
I know I'm
understood them-
short.
I understood them the first time.
I know I'm short, and you maybe can't see me sometimes, but I do want to do 1 minute, then 1 minute. So if either of you have a question for the other, kind of write it down, so when it's your minute, you can, say it, okay? So Joe, you still had some time left on your time.
No,
Do
Fran,
you
I
want to
was
finish it?
Oh, he can go
No, I
ahead.
know, but I wanted him to finish his statement, then you can answer it.
No, he can go back and then it
All
can
right.
finish after.
Okay, Tom?
There are two separate issues, the Pacheco law and project labor agreements. Joe has a tendency to meld the two of them together. They're mutually exclusive. The Pacheco law says that anything over $500,000, the company, the private company, and I benefited from some of this, has to pass a credibility test. I don't think anyone would disagree with that. The project labor agreement is what Joe's referring to when he speaks of unions. That's where a project is dedicated to just union contractors. He's right, but they're two separate issues. They're not related. I come from that construction world. I've benefited and I've been pained by the process. I'm all for privatization. I'm all for free enterprise. It's just that before we move to the private sector and relinquish the responsibility of government, they have to prove that they can do it more efficiently. I don't know how anybody can disagree with that.
All right, thank you. You have the last word on this.
Again,